Okay. My name is Martha Burge. I work as an ADHD coach, a speaker now, and an author. My specialty is really with people who have been diagnosed with ADHD, but I also work with people with high IQ. I work with people from Mensa because I find that they have an awful lot in common.
Really interesting.
Yeah, I found it interesting. And I found that quite by accident. I was coaching people with ADHD, found a couple of people within Mensa that were interested in having some coaching, and found that they were dealing with really almost all of the same issues. And I started, that was probably when I first started seeing some of the connections. So I started into this. This was actually probably 20 years ago, when my first child had been diagnosed with ADHD, and then I had a second child, and I started looking at the similarities there. They had problems in school, they had the typical, well, I'm finding out it's not typical with all of the kids with ADHD, but a lot of the kids with ADHD getting kicked out of school, getting kicked out of daycare, just being generally difficult children to raise. And so I started becoming interested in it then, because everyone else seemed to have such problems with my kids. And I thought they were pretty normal. And when we finally did get diagnoses, and we actually went down the path of trying the medications as well, which were a horrible failure. But when we went down that path and I understood then, okay, they have a diagnosis for this, and there's a name for it, and okay, it's a mental disorder, I thought that really just doesn't seem right. These are bright kids, and they are really, to me, seem very well adjusted, but they're different. So that's when I just started looking into it and trying to find out more about it. Went back to school, got degrees in psychology, still searching, still trying to figure this whole thing out. And I finally realized that everything that I was learning from all of the experts was just not satisfactory. It wasn't really explaining the whole thing. So that's when I started branching out on my own and saying, okay, I need to do some of my own research.
Absolutely.
Well, they would get into mischief if they got bored, which they did a lot. They were both very bright. And if they had a really exciting, really like a storytelling kind of a teacher, they were great. And they were wonderful kids, and I'd get, teachers telling me, what a pleasure to have your kid in class. It's just so wonderful. But unfortunately, most of the teachers aren't like that. And so if the teacher is boring, the subject is boring, one of the things that they have challenges with is learning things that are memorizing. It's not interesting, right? So it's just a process of memorizing things and going down a really boring path. They'd find things to do. My firstborn, I got the first note home from school when he was in first grade, because in kindergarten they kind of let them run around and play and everything is fine and they can be themselves. In first grade, now you're supposed to start sitting in your desk all the time and being still and allowing the teacher to push information into you, and you're just supposed to sit there like a sponge and absorb. And he was having no part of that. So the first note I got home was about him crawling underneath the other children's desks and tying their shoelaces together. I knew that I should probably be mad and upset about that, but I just thought that it was so creative and so fun. But they have a number of different things. So one of them is they don't deal well with being bored. And none of us who are what I call intense deal very well with being bored. Another thing is that the emotions are very intense. So they actually experience emotions to a greater degree than other people. So if they're angry, they're more angry, and you're really going to see that coming out. If they're happy, they're more happy. They don't just be happy, they have glee spasms. So there's just more of them going on. And I think those are a couple of the things that other people recognized as problems in them that I thought I don't really think that's a problem. But the one I think that creates the most trouble for the kids is the hyperactivity. Intense people have a lot of energy that needs to be expressed in some way. And we think about it in terms of, with kids, as that physical hyperactivity, so they're running around and they're doing things, but it can also be expressed through, really lots of hand gestures, which I'll probably be real guilty of while we sit here, and talking an awful lot. And so those are the things that get kids in trouble in school. If, my sons were always in trouble for not staying in their seat, for, just being too active. When I was in school, I was always in trouble for turning around and talking to my neighbor. It's just, there's something that has to be going on all the time. The similarity between people who are in Mensa, who have been, they have to take a test to join Mensa, so they're very high IQ. And the similarity between them and the people with ADHD, which it seems counterintuitive, but when you finally get down to that root of what's behind both very creative intelligence and ADHD type symptoms, the root of it is intensity. And intensity expresses itself in 5 different ways. So it can be sensual intensity, it can be that psychomotor intensity, which is the hyperactivity portion of it, but another part of it is intellectual intensity. And intellectual intensity is the one that I see really often with the people in Mensa, but they have the other ones as well. And then there's creative intensity and emotional intensity. And I found that people who have been diagnosed with ADHD, and a lot, not all, but a lot of people who are in Mensa and have very high IQ have the same emotional intensities. And they have, surprisingly, the same sensual intensities. So they have sensitivity to bright lights, they have real their sense, how do I want to say this? They have a very finely tuned sense of perhaps hearing. They may be musicians. They have a sense of beauty and being able to recognize beauty. So those things are the same across both populations. So really it has much more to do with how they've self-identified than it has to do with being different. They seem to have the same base intensity. But one group has said, I've recognized that a lot of people can't keep up with me intellectually, or they told me that I was smart the whole time when I was growing up or whatever, and they test and they go into Mensa. Another group of people don't self-identify that way, and they recognize themselves as, well, I kept getting in trouble all the time, and people told me there was something wrong with me, and so, maybe I have some kind of a disorder. And they may be diagnosed with ADHD. They also may be diagnosed with anxiety disorder, with bipolar, any of the mood disorders. All of these things are really common misdiagnoses for something that really is completely natural. There are 2 types of ADD coaching. One type is what we call a mother coach. And that's the one, people come to a mother coach because they say, I can't get organized, and I have had trouble paying my bills, and I know that I'm not going as far in my profession as I could if I were just able to really get down to the work and do things differently. And so they have already judged themselves to be lacking. And they want someone to make them toe the line. They want someone who is going to make them make goals and, you know, have them report on their progress on those goals on a regular basis. And so that's kind of the mother coach. The other kind of ADD coach, and the kind that I am, is more about being able to understand why you are the way you are. So instead of seeing yourself as disordered, beginning to understand that this is something else entirely. It's, yes, all of the symptoms that are presented for ADHD are normally really there, but that's just looking at a little tiny part of the picture. And if you look at the whole picture, that's almost nothing compared to all of the gifts and all of the capabilities that are there. So when I'm working with someone who has ADHD or who's been diagnosed or suspects that they have ADHD, or as I call them sometimes ADD-ish, then what I'm working on is helping them to really understand their true nature, how that's different than other people, and how to develop that so that they can really bring out all of their natural gifts and not be so concerned about some of the things that they've seen as signs of disorder. Yeah, this is one of the harder things for people to understand, or more often for people around them to understand, that intensity can be painful and uncomfortable. So sensual intensity, just minor differences in the way that our systems interpret the sensory information that's coming in, can make the world a little bit more uncomfortable every day, all the time. And then having a mind that won't turn off can be uncomfortable, and having emotions that are much stronger than most people's can be really uncomfortable as well. So all of this can really translate into a somewhat painful existence if you don't know how to deal with it. So people will start self-medicating, and it's perfectly natural that they'll go down this path. It's not the path that I like to see them go down, but quite often, you know, I see people who are very, very intense, who smoke marijuana, not recreationally, daily. It's medicinal. They have to have it on a regular basis. They may drink alcohol, and it's not social drinking, and it's not alcoholic type drinking. It's medicinal. It's keeping themselves on a more acceptable energy level and reducing the pain to a level where it's fine to be here and to be alive. So it's, once started, it's a difficult thing for a person to give up, because there's usually some amount of pain, and then learning to adjust a different way. So it's really pretty common. The one thing that I really try to get people to start working on, even before they've given up anything, is to start meditating. And there's a lot of different kinds of meditation. It doesn't have to be that boring, you know, sitting there repeating a mantra. There are a lot of kinds of meditation that are a lot more fun than that and a lot more interesting. So it's not as bad as it usually sounds immediately to intense people to meditate, but I really do like to see them start meditating for a few months before they start thinking about, okay, maybe I don't need to be smoking marijuana all the time. Maybe I don't need to drink every day. Anxiety is one of the key traits of intensity. And it's both good and bad. It's the reason that sometimes we're diagnosed with anxiety disorders. It is uncomfortable, and it is something that makes it more difficult to be around other people and to be in certain situations. So being anxious is uncomfortable, but the good side of being anxious is that anxiety is what continues to propel us forward. One of the things that I tell parents when they're very concerned about, my child is maybe socially and emotionally not with his peers, that he seems to be younger, and I think maybe there's something wrong. That's perfectly natural. Intense people develop asynchronously. Actually, it's pretty synchronous for intense people, but if you try to compare them to non-intense people, it appears to be, they may develop intellectually early, but they develop emotionally later. And so parents worry about that, and they think, oh, perhaps, I really have a child with an emotional problem. What it is just their own development path. And they're developing, in my opinion, and when I look at the young children and then I look at people, throughout the lifespan and what has happened with them emotionally and socially, they develop more deeply, so it seems to take longer. And a part of what continues to push them on is anxiety. So being anxious and not being comfortable and knowing, there's something that I want to do to change this, and I want to grow beyond this. I want to, continue to go. It pushes intense people to a much higher level of emotional development than their non-intense peers if they're in the right surroundings. So anxiety is really one of our best friends, even though it's a little uncomfortable. This is the first story I start all of my parents out with, because they usually come to me because they're worried. They have a child that's not fitting in. They may have been diagnosed with ADHD. Quite often they've already tried medication, and it didn't do the miracle that was promised. Maybe the kid's doing a little bit better in school, or they're a little bit calmer, but they worry about the side effects. And so they come to me just concerned about, I think I have a broken kid. So I start with the story of the ugly duckling. And this one is, a lot of people remember this from their childhood, but basically this huge, ugly, awkward duckling was born to this mother duck with all of her normal, beautiful little yellow ducklings. And she was really cautious about it and not sure. And the other ducks were telling her, I think it's a turkey and I think you should probably get rid of it. And she really wasn't sure. And on the day that she decided she was going to take all the ducklings down to the pond and teach them all to swim, she said, what, this is it. If he can't swim, I know he's not mine. That's it, forget it. So she took all the ducklings down to the pond, and this big ugly duckling swam better than all the other ones. And so she decided, okay, he's mine. I know it. I can tell because he swims so beautifully. And so she was won over, but the rest of the ducks in the little duck community were not. And they continued to give him a very hard time. Finally, it just became too much for him, and he ran away. He managed to make it through the winter. It was a very tough winter for him, and someone took him in. And in the springtime, he was so convinced that he was so ugly and he just couldn't fit in anywhere, and everyone hated him, that he decided that he was going to commit suicide. And he looked out over that same pond and he saw all the swans flying in, and he thought, that's it, that's how I'll do it. They're so beautiful. I'll just fly out there and they'll kill me for my ugliness. And so he flew out there to all of the swans, and he bent his head down because he was expecting, here comes the first blow. They'll kill me now. And that was when he saw his reflection in the water, and he realized he was a swan. And I tell this to parents because I want them to recognize their swans. Instead of thinking that their children are supposed to fall in line with all of the other children, they need to understand that these are children of a different sort. This is really important. This is not a disorder. This is not a fluke. This kind of difference, this thing that I'm calling intensity, is found naturally in 15 to 20% of the population. That's why the numbers can continue to soar of the number of people that can be diagnosed with ADHD. It's really 15 to 20% of the population. It's also found in 15 to 20% of the population of any species that's been studied. So it's completely natural, but we don't understand it. So what I want these parents to understand is you have a different sort of child, and they have all of these gifts, and they have incredible creativity and wonderful intellectual abilities and all kinds of gifts that come with this. But they're never going to realize those gifts as long as you're trying to get them to be a good duck. They need to be a swan. Yeah, Tom Hartman wrote about a theory about ADHD, and I think he had the same instincts that this is not something that's broken. There must be another explanation for it. And his theory was that we are all descended either from societies of farmers or of hunters. And those who are descended from many, many generations ago from societies of hunters have skills that were valuable for hunters. So they're able to tune in, to a particular, like if they're hunting something, they can tune into that and see nothing else around them. But when they're not, everything around them comes in, because you never know where there might be something that you want to hunt. So in our terms today, that ability for everything to come in is called distractibility. The ones that come from the farming background have bred into them all of the strengths that are good for farmers. So they work cooperatively with others very well. They can be very patient. They can do things in a very orderly fashion. So if you think about, planting crops, right? You've got to till those straight rows. You've got to plant your seeds in, even distance apart. You've got to, water it again and again and again with nothing showing up for you. Well, to one of the hunters, that would just be too boring to be able to do. But to one of the farmers, that's what they're bred for. And then when it comes time for the harvest, they all get together, they work very cooperatively and well together, and they all accomplish the harvest. Whereas the hunters, they may have to work well together to bring down some big beast, but they have to handle themselves alone. They have to be able to look out for themselves. So that's his theory. I like it a lot. I don't know how much of it can actually be backed up, because I haven't seen that intense people are from one particular background or another. But I love the explanation. He created this because he had a home for boys that were like in trouble, and a lot of them were diagnosed with ADHD. And he wanted a way to explain it to them that let them understand they're not broken. So in that way, I think it's very similar.
Yeah, it's effective.
Okay, so speaking as a non-intense person, how do I handle this intense person? Little clues for that? Yeah. The one thing I can tell you about living with an intense person, if you're in relationship with an intense person, is that they're always going to be intense. So don't plan on that changing. They will always be intense. But as I mentioned before, they will also always be growing. And so if you take an intense person and they have decided that what they want to do is make this relationship work, if that becomes a focus for them, then they're going to do everything in their power to make that happen. So emotional intensity, I know that can be really difficult to deal with, especially if you're not as emotionally intense, and seeing someone that it can look from the outside like they're trying to be difficult. I think probably an understanding that they're not trying to be difficult, that they're experiencing an emotion that's that much stronger. That's probably the first thing for you to be able to be in that environment and be okay. Because those strong emotions, we get accused, us intense people are accused on a regular basis of overreacting, being, drama queens or whatever. I've even seen, young boys that are accused of being mama's boys or crybabies, things like that, really hurtful labels. But what people don't understand is the amount of emotion that's being expressed is exactly proportionate to the amount of emotion that's being felt. So it's not an overreaction, it's an exactly appropriate reaction. It's just that there's more being felt. And I know that's hard to understand. It might even be hard to believe, but it's really true. Once you really understand that and you're with that intense person and you get that, okay, he or she is just expressing what's really going on, and they can feel that you get that you understand that, it's going to get a lot easier. Okay, yeah, about medication. I'm not 100% anti-medication. And a lot of people think that I am because that's not the first place that I would go. I have coaching clients who are on medication or have their children on medication, and I don't tell them, oh, you shouldn't do that. But I think that there are some things that you have to do to be responsible about that. So these are basically very, very strong medications, and they present certain challenges. I see on the ADD blogs, where people are going on and talking about their experience and what they're doing. I've seen so many parents that are so willing to give their children medication before considering anything else, before even really understanding what it is that's going on with that kid. They think you just give them a pill and that fixes it, and it doesn't. It doesn't fix it because there's not something that's broken. So that I'm vehemently opposed to that approach. I think that it's irresponsible. But I do know that there are times when, particularly when kids are going through school and they're that different, if they can be on a medication that is their doctor's monitoring and it's safe enough for them, I think sometimes socially it can make all the difference in the world. So that's why I don't tell these parents you need to get your kid off this medication, because sometimes if they can get a year or two in where they're behaving a little bit more like a non-intense person, and they get that feeling for, well, what's it like to make a friend and keep a friend? What's it like to be invited to parties and to have people want to come over to your house and stay? That can really make a huge difference. That can change their outlook on themselves going forward. So in that case, I think that it can be helpful. But I don't think that it's anything that's useful long term. And I do think that it's incredibly dangerous. I have a personal history with this that makes me much more cautious about it. One of my sons was on medication for ADHD, and I thought, he seems to be doing okay. And we went back to the doctor, and the doctor was asking him, so how are you doing? He says, oh, well, it's pretty good, except for the auditory hallucinations. And she thought, okay, he can't possibly know what that is. So she started quizzing him, and yes, he knew exactly what it was, and he gave her examples of things that he was hearing. And I thought, and I didn't even ask. I didn't even ask him, is anything strange happening to you while you're on this medicine? So that's the reason that I'm so cautious. That could have been so dangerous. The path that I take, and I've tried a lot of different paths. I've tried a traditional coaching path. I was trained in ontological coaching, and I've tried that path.
What is that?
Ontological coaching is a kind of coaching. It has to do with ontology, as the study of being, and a lot of what I do has that as a base. It has a lot of theories that work really well, such as everything being related to everything. So if my body is feeling a certain way, that's going to have an impact on my thoughts, and it's going to have an impact on my emotions. skills. And all of these things are all connected together. And so the path in to coaching, in ontological coaching, can be through the intellect. It can be through questioning. It can be through, a verbal approach. But it can also be through your emotions. And it can be through your body and through movement. So I've done that approach. What I found is that the most effective approach has 3 parts. It is, first of all, education. And that really it flies in the face of all of the coaching. Coaching is never supposed to be about education or mentoring or anything. It's about really letting what happens in the moment. You go through it together and you learn as you go through it together. I found that that doesn't work until you've had the education. So people need to have an education. They need to understand intensity. They need to understand all 5 of the intensities and how they relate to them personally, because it's going to be a little different for each person, where they've had their challenges and where there are opportunities for development. So this understanding creates this breakthrough moment. And it's beautiful. So that's the beginning of it, is the education. And the education, we usually will have a breakthrough moment where it's like, I get it, I'm not broken. I'm intense. I understand all of these weird things that I thought were disconnected and separate things. Now they all make sense. This is who I am. And it's a wonderful healing moment, but that's not the end of the education, and it continues to go on. So that's a part of the ongoing relationship, is continuing that education and continuing to be able to point out, do you think that might have to do with this intensity? And were you in pain when you were doing that? And those kinds of things. So that goes on. The second thing that's really important is having support. Being intense, I think, as you've gathered by now, isn't really easy. So we don't get to choose this path. This is something that we're born into. And if you're born intense, you're not going to have that easy life. Things are going to be more challenging. There's a lot more growth to do. And we don't reach a certain development level and stop. We keep going. So that work of development continues to go. So we're dealing with pain, we're dealing with anxiety. A lot of us are perfectionists. We have a lot of things that we're dealing with, so we need support. No matter how far you develop emotionally and socially and as an intense person, if you can get to the pinnacle of what Maslow would call self-actualized, and you get to the very top of that, you're still intense. And it's still a way of being that is much easier to handle if you have support. So that's the second part of it, is the support. And then the third part are practices. Some of the practices, we usually design practices on the fly. So some of them, and I put a lot of them in my book, are based on meditation, because I think that's a really important one, to be able to really speed up that growth process. But there are all different kinds of practices that one might do if you're working on developing a relationship, or changing the way you react in a particular situation, or whatever is bothering them. There are quite often practices that can be done to develop one of the intensities into a gift that allows them to handle that. So those are the 3 parts. Yeah, I'll give you an example. One of the intensities is the sensual intensity. So, for example, right now there are bright lights trained on me. It's painful. It's not so painful that I can't do it, but it's painful, and I'll have a headache for a while because I'm sensually intense. And I know that. I go through that every day. If I'm in fluorescent lighting, it's uncomfortable for me. The way my clothes feel on my skin is very important. I shop for everything by feel. So the environment that I'm in has everything to do, because it's going to come in. My senses are taking everything in the environment, because it's as if it gets intensified coming in. So as everything is coming into me, I may experience that discomfort. It may be one of those things that this is a maybe not so nice part of it. But the other thing that happens with everything coming in, things that I may not even have been paying attention to are coming in. is there's a gift in that of having an intuitive ability, that there's more information coming in, therefore I'm catching on to things that other people aren't catching on to. I pick up little tiny things that I may not even have noticed that I picked up, but somehow I'm more intuitive than my non-intense friends, and I know that it's related to that. So that's one of those things where it's not going to mean that I no longer experience discomfort, but I've found the gift in it, and the gift is so valuable I would never give it up. I'm okay. I'm okay. It's okay. No. Yeah, we work as needed. Normally at least 6 months, but the sessions might not be weekly. So normally I'll start off with someone, meeting with them weekly, and then we can go to every other week. And it gets a little further apart. Usually when someone has, I feel like, really, you're doing fine. You know your gifts, you're doing great. It's kind of the you're ready to be released into the wild kind of feeling. Go out and do great things now that you know who you are and what you can do. But then I leave it open. If you want to come back, if something goes backwards, or you're confused about something or whatever, I'm always open. But it's 6 months to a year. I have a parent now that I've been working with for a year and a half, and it just works for her because her daughter is growing and changing, and it's like as soon as she's kind of got this whole intensity thing figured out, her child hits another level and she's lost again. So it can go on for a while. My ideal is to not have people be lifetime clients. I really think that the biggest hurdle is when you get past that feeling of being broken and go through, there's usually some grief associated with that, when you realize I spent all of this time thinking I was broken, and what about all that time that I lost? Or parents who say, gosh, if I'd known this 10 years ago, and I wouldn't have told my child they were broken. That's the first part, and getting through that, really understanding the intensity. I believe that it should be completely possible for people who are, if they're really into working on it themselves, to come into coaching, go through 2 to 3 months, and really fly, take off and fly. Yeah. I went down that path with my kids. And we did the Fine Gold diet, and I could tell you, I could look at my kid and tell you what someone had given him to eat at school. So I know definitely we react to sugars, to dyes, to salicylates. It shouldn't be a surprise though. Think about being sensitive. So.
Is maybe I could have sugar and be a little agitated. Someone who's intense has sugar in it.
It might be bigger, yeah.
Be bigger.
Yeah.
And also maybe it has the same effect on our bodies, and same with alcohol and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, I have seen, and I experience myself, that coffee seems to be something we use to calm ourselves down and focus, and without many negative side effects. So that's the one that I haven't seen negative side effects from that one, and it's a way of self-medicating that seems to be okay. But yeah, sensitivities to food, sensitivities. There was a study done on babies who were, now listen and see if you don't think this is intensity, babies who would react more strongly to a sudden sound or a flash of light or something. So some babies will, do this, and then some babies are going to just flail and react more strongly. In those babies' families, there was a much higher incidence of hay fever type allergies. And I thought, I wonder, that's the closest I've come to any kind of proof with that, but we're sensitive to the environment. So we're sensitive to the foods that we put in, we're sensitive to the everything in the environment, including pollens and any kind of toxins.
So
I think that it's a possibility. I think that there are some things that some foods and some substances that are so harmful that yes, you definitely should do that. I'm not convinced that a completely purified diet is going to make a lot of difference, because remember, we're intense. We're always going to be intense. So changing your diet may make you a little bit more comfortable. You're still going to be emotionally intense. You're still going to have anxiety. You're still going to have all of those things going on. It's living life really big. I see there's a lot of speculation about, is ADHD becoming an epidemic? Are more and more people becoming ADD? What's going on with this? I from what I can tell so far, and from the studies that I've found, it's a pretty constant 15 to 20%. So I don't think that it's increasing, but I do think that we're living life faster, and the kind of farmer culture that probably most of society, and if you believe the 15 to 20%, then it would be 80 to 85% would be much more comfortable with a little bit slower existence. And to exist in the way the world is speeding up, yeah, they drink a lot of caffeine, and it's go, 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 and it can be pretty taxing on them. For intense people, we're kind of that way anyway. So, you have those who are naturally going to move a little bit faster, going to be involved in more things, going to be overcommitted, and that go down that path, because most of us who are intense are going to do that. We have at least 6 projects always going, but I just think that it's more a cultural change than it is people becoming ADD. No, actually, the really, really early criteria was supposing that there's some kind of even a physical brain dysfunction. As they've learned more and more and more about it, there's no physical difference in the brain whatsoever. The functioning of the brain is different, but they can't nail it down. Even Dr. Amen, who has done all of these studies and all of the scans of the brains, has 6 different flavors of ADD. So I don't know that would have anything to do with it. And then having a childhood trauma, I think having a childhood trauma, if you're intense by birth, and having a childhood trauma, you had not a childhood trauma, you had a childhood trauma. So there's more emotional damage, there's probably more acting out. So I can see how someone could draw that conclusion that, oh, they had this trauma and so therefore they became this way. I don't believe that. I believe you're born this way. You know what they outgrow? Outwardly showing the hyperactivity. That's about all they outgrow. And they don't outgrow the hyperactivity. If you look at anybody who was diagnosed with ADHD as a child, and a strong component of it for them was hyperactivity, they're doing one of two things. They're either hyper and they're holding it in, so you'll see, you know, the foot's going, they've got the jimmy leg, they're always tapping something, they're moving all the time, or they're self-medicating. Because it's